Welcome back. We are continuing our studies of the Greek of the New Testament and coming this time to the 23rd chapter of Machen's fine little textbook, a chapter which concerns the topic known as contract verbs. Contract verbs are given that name because, as you've probably surmised if you look through the chapter, they have what amounts to a hidden vowel, which is contracted into the ending so that the ending can look a little bit unexpected until you learn the rules that govern contract verbs. Now, I need to just say at the very beginning here that contract verbs are not any different from any other verbs that we find in the New Testament. It's simply the manner in which the spelling is formulated, and especially the way in which the accent marks are applied, that make contract verbs somewhat distinctive. But it's not as if this is some sort of separate class of verbs in the sense that they have some different meaning or anything of that nature. It's just the pure formulation of the verb. The rules of contraction can sometimes seem a little bit complicated, and I'm going to spend the bulk of my time now, instead of just giving you this preamble, I'm going to actually look at these rules and try to give you a couple of examples of them as we go along, and I think that'll help. There is a kind of logic to them, and if you'll not be too put off by them, but just try to understand the basic application of the rules, then I think you'll see that it's not as difficult as it may at first appear. We'll take a look at the vocabulary words first of all. You'll notice that many of the words that we find here are actually words that you may be somewhat familiar with already, as common in the Greek New Testament. Machen has postponed dealing with these verbs because he wanted to get some other material before us first of all, but at this point it's worthwhile to go ahead and incorporate a reflection upon these particular verbs. So verbs like, for example, agapao, that word, which is based on the Greek word agape, meaning love, means I love. You notice that kind of strange sound, agapao, that a-o at the end is signaling for us that there's a contraction that's going to go on. If you look at the New Testament, you'll never find that word as such. You'll never find agapao. You'll find that the alpha there at the end is actually contracted into the omega, so you'd simply see the word agapo. But it helps to know that there's been a contraction because that explains some of the somewhat strange effects that it'll have in terms of accenting, and also some other matters that come up as well. So let's first of all take a look at the vocabulary words as we typically do, and then, as I say, I want to work through each of the rules that have to do with the rules of accent and contract verbs, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the exercises, and I think you'll find the chapter, aside from these rules, to be very straightforward and hopefully somewhat enjoyable. So let's go ahead and take a look at the vocabulary. Well, as I just mentioned, the first vocabulary word that we run into here is this word agapao. And you'll notice, of course, the distinctive character is that alpha, which when we actually apply the rules of contraction are going to be, that alpha will be absorbed into the omega, so you'd actually see it in the New Testament as agapo, love. But it's helpful to know that the hiding vowel there is alpha, so we want to get the uncontracted form to appear in the vocabulary list so we know what's going on when we apply the rules of contraction. This word is otherwise familiar to you. This is from the Greek word agape, which means love, and of course this verb means I love. The next word is akolutheo. Akolutheo, again, this distinctive contracted vowel, epsilon. If you found this in the New Testament, you would simply see the word akolutho, accent on the last syllable. This means I follow. I don't know any English derivatives from this, so you'll just have to learn this one. Be advised, this is not a prefix. If you're going to augment, you won't replace the omicron here with an epsilon or something like that. You actually augment the first letter. So this is not a something like a preposition at the beginning of a verb, as we've seen on certain other words. Akolutheo means I follow. Notice that it takes the dative. So if I'm going to say I follow him, akolutho auto. Auto in the dative case there, I follow him. Galilee, this is another of these proper nouns that we find. You'll notice the capital gamma there at the beginning, so we're learning another capital at this point, along with the ones that we learned in the last chapter. This word is Galilee. Of course, it's very similar to the English word that we have in our English New Testaments, Galilee. And so that's the word Galileia, and it refers to Galilee. Feminine noun, so keep that in mind as we go. Deloo is a word that means I show or I make manifest. I show something to someone. Deloo. Here the contracted vowel is an omicron. And so omicron, again, would be contracted into the omega. If you found this in the New Testament in the first person singular, it would simply be delo with a circumflex on the ultima. But in order to apply the rules of contraction, again, we need to know that hiding behind that omega is this omicron. And so that's what we'll keep in mind. Again, I don't know of any English derivatives from this, so you'll just need to learn this one. Deloo, I make manifest, or I show. Eulogeo, you here, of course, is a prefix, and in general, the word you as a prefix means some form of good. We, of course, have many English words that have a similar sort of prefix, euphemism, euthanize, and so on. All of those have that you prefix, which means something good or pleasant. The logeo, of course, you recognize as the root logos, which means word. And so literally this means a good word, and it's translated by the English word to bless. So if I bless somebody, then I'm pronouncing upon them a good word. It's a contract verb. There's our contracted vowel. It's the epsilon, which will ordinarily contract into the omega or some other ending in a manner that we'll notice in a few minutes. Next word we have is eucharisteo. Again, we have the you prefix, good. Charis, you recognize, is the word that means grace. And so this is literally good grace. It is a contract verb with the epsilon contracting into the omega. It idiomatically translates into English as I give thanks. And of course, you immediately recognize the Eucharist, which is celebrated in Christian communities, is the term for the Lord's Supper, but the actual literal meaning of it is I give thanks. And it was, of course, adopted very early in the church's history as a proper expression of the state of heart of the Christian person when they come to the celebration of the Lord's Supper as a state of gratitude or of giving thanks. So, Eucharisteo, I give thanks. Zeteo, again a contract verb with the epsilon there, means I seek. And so zeteo is going to be a word often used in the New Testament. I don't know any English derivatives from that, so you just have to learn that one. Zeteo, I seek. Theoreo, I behold. This, of course, is the word behind the English word theory. A theory is when you behold something in your mind. You may theorize a certain hypothesis and then decide to test it out by some sort of experimental procedure, but that process of theorizing it is beholding it, and so it's no surprise when we come to the New Testament we find that this word theoreo, to behold, is related to that English word. The next word we come to is the word kaleo. Kaleo, and of course you'll immediately recognize that kaleo is the word from which we get the English word call, as in calling you on the phone, and so that should be easy to remember. The reason that Machen provides for you the principal parts is because there is an exception to the rule that applies here. You'll notice it's a contract verb, so we have kaleo. The future is going to be kaleso. The aorist will be a kalesa, and the aorist passive, skipping over the fourth and fifth of the principal parts, is a klephane. Now I'm just telling you at this point that there's an exception which applies to this particular epsilon, which is of course part of the contract verb, and that it doesn't change in the future or in the aorist. I'm going to save further explanation of that for a little bit later because it doesn't quite make sense now to try to go into it, but just bear that in mind. We'll come back and take a look at that verb just a little bit later in connection with our discussion of the formation of the future and the aorist in connection with contract verbs. All right, and now finishing off our vocabulary, the next word we have is laleo. This is the contract verb which means to speak. You may recognize that the word hallelujah uses that laleo term within it. Hallelujah actually has its roots in a Greek formulation, and so hallelujah, to speak praise, is the idea. Laleo means to speak, not to be confused with lego, which means to say. So, of course, saying is a somewhat more informal word. To speak implies a more formal kind of setting, especially speaking to a group or speaking in some sort of more formal sense or weighty sense. So, laleo, I speak. Parakaleo is the word which literally means to call from. It's related, of course, to a word you probably know, parakletos, which is the word which means a paraclete or an advocate. It was actually a first century lawyer you may be interested in knowing. We'll save further conversation about that for another time. But this word parakaleo literally means to exhort, to give somebody some kind of very forceful direction, or to comfort. And so either one of those, that's why sometimes the paraclete is called the comforter. But the other sense of it is also to advocate. And so you have that as well as a certain sense of that word as it's used in the New Testament. Machen doesn't mention that, but it does show up occasionally. And so when we read, for example, in 1 John 2:2 that we have an advocate, a parakletos with the Father, that's really the sense, almost as if we have a lawyer, you see, with the Father is the idea. Again, the Holy Spirit has a similar role in his parakletos function on earth. So all of those are related to this word parakaleo, I comfort or I exhort. The next word is peripateo. This word means I walk. Maybe you're familiar with the term of peripatetic philosopher. That's a philosopher who in the ancient world would teach while walking around, and that's where this word comes from, peripateo, I walk. Poieo, contract verb, means I make or I do. And so this is, of course, a common word in the New Testament. Contract verb, as I say, I don't know any English derivatives from it, so simply one to learn. Proskuneo means I worship. Usually takes the dative case, so keep in mind that that's what's going on. We have this, of course, prefix, pros, and then kuneo, so taken together is the idea of worshiping. We have stauroo, I crucify, obviously used strategically in the New Testament. The verb to crucify, it's a contract verb with omicron, stauroo. Tereo means I keep, as in I keep my word, I keep God's commandments, that sort of thing, contract verb on epsilon. Timao means I honor. It's a contract verb on alpha. The name Timothy, you may recognize, is based on timao, which is I honor, and then the theos part of that is I honor God. So Timothy is a name that literally means one who honors God. So if you happen to be named Timothy, then you have a very high responsibility, obviously, in your name. Phileo, another name for love. We looked at agapao earlier. Agapao, of course, is related to the highest kind of love contemplated in the New Testament. Phileo is more brotherly love or reciprocal love. Obviously, this is the root of the word Philadelphia. In the New Testament, it would simply be philo, I love, and philae is the noun form of that, love in this sense. Usually regarded as brotherly love or friendship love, reciprocal love, as opposed to what I like to call sometimes cold-blooded love, which is the love agape, which is not the least bit dependent upon the object of the love, but depends entirely on the character of the one doing the loving. Phileo, on the other hand, carries more the idea of a kind of reciprocity of affection. Korah is a feminine noun. It means country. You find this in the New Testament quite a bit. With an alpha preceded by a rho, you know that the alpha is going to remain an alpha throughout the declension. and so cora is just a common word that you'll need to learn. All right, well, as I indicated, I'd like to look at each of these rules for contraction. For once, you're looking at English text here on your screen, but hopefully this will help facilitate our conversation. I've rewritten some of these rules slightly in order to illustrate the point, but just the first one's pretty obvious. Open and close vowels form a diphthong. You may recall from way back in chapter 2 that we made a distinction between open and close vowels. Close vowels are simply the vowels that conclude a diphthong. And in Greek there are only two, iota and upsilon. So those two are close vowels. All the other vowels are open vowels. And so when you have an open vowel followed by a close vowel, then invariably it's going to form a diphthong. So for example, if we have the word, as you know, we've seen this course countless times now, luace, you've got an epsilon followed by a close vowel, iota, and those together form a diphthong. You see that, and of course we've just assumed that throughout our studies of Greek, but you'll be happy to know that's the first rule of contraction. Nothing's being contracted here really. The two vowels are simply being united together, and there we have the formation of a diphthong. All right, the second rule, two like vowels form the common long. Two like vowels form the common long. So you notice that, for example, alpha is like alpha. That seems fairly obvious, but it will form long alpha. So if you have in a given word the letter alpha followed by some ending that begins with alpha, then it's going to contract to form a long alpha. Epsilon, which is short, will combine with its cousin vowel, eta, to form the long, which of course is going to be an eta. Epsilon is always short. Similarly, omicron, which is always short, combined with an omega, which is always long, will produce an omega. There's a variety of words, of course, in the New Testament in which you're going to find that kind of thing taking place. So, for example, we had the word delao, which you recall means I show or I make. Well, let's say we were going to use that in the subjunctive first person plural. Well, that would look like de la omen. Remember that? De la omen. And in that case, you would have an omicron uniting with an omega. Well, the two are going to combine by contraction, so the word would actually be de lomen with a circumflex on the omega there, as is dictated by the rules of accent. So you will have occasion when contract verbs will form with various endings, and this is the way in which you apply the rule. So essentially, keep in mind that if the two vowels are like, alpha with alpha, epsilon with eta, omicron with omega, then they're simply going to form the long of those two like vowels, and that's really all you need to know. So that one's pretty straightforward. But now we come to number 3, which is actually an exception to Rule 2. And so Rule 2, as you know, had the combination of like vowels. The exception is a double epsilon or a double omicron form the diphthongs that we find here. So I mentioned to you epsilon eta, which are like vowels, form a long eta. But epsilon, epsilon, if you happen to have a circumstance where those two short vowels actually are put next to each other, then instead of forming an eta, it's going to form the diphthong epsilon iota. Epsilon iota. So that's something to bear in mind. And the other exception is when you have omicron, omicron. Here we had omicron omega, but if it's the double omicron together, then it's going to form the diphthong omicron upsilon. So you've got Rule 2, straightforward, and then two exceptions. The exceptions have to do with these two, a double epsilon or a double omicron, forming respectively epsilon iota or omicron upsilon. All right, well, next of all, we have Rule 4, omicron wins over alpha, epsilon, or eta. So a good example of this might be what we find right here. I've restated this rule a little bit differently from the way Machen puts it, but hopefully reading the two together will give you the idea. If you figure there's kind of a contest going on in contraction as to which vowel is going to be dominant in the resulting diphthong, then omicron or its cousin omega tend to win. So just by way of an example, I've got agapao here, a contract verb on alpha. If I want to say we love, it would be agapa omen. Remember that? The accent is here, and I would put that. But of course, a contract verb is going to unite these two. Well, I notice immediately that an omicron is in the picture. Omicron wins, and so the result is going to be the long of the omicron and omega. Because one of the two syllables that's contracted was accented, the accent remains on the resulting syllable. If the last is short, a long accented penult takes the circumflex, so it's going to be agapomen, we love. So that's a pretty typical example of how these rules of contraction will work. Again, Rule 5 is an exception to the Rule of 4. We said in Rule 4 that omicron will prevail over the other vowels that we mentioned, but here's an exception. For example, epsilon, omicron in either order. So whether the epsilon comes first or the omicron doesn't matter. Either way, omicron and epsilon are going to produce an omicron upsilon result. So by way of example, I've got phileo. I want to say we love. It would be phileomen. Accent is here. When we combine these two, you see the rule ordinarily would have said we'd wind up with an omega, but this is the exception. It's going to be rather the omicron upsilon with the circumflex once again on that resulting syllable, because the accent was there in the first place, and the short ultima requires a circumflex on a long accented penult. So phileo becomes philumen, you see, rather than philomen, which would have been what we might have expected. Now, moving to the sixth, the last rule of this section, what I'm calling the priority rule of alpha, epsilon, and eta. So let's say that we don't have an omicron or an omega in the discussion. Notice that the previous rule would have indicated that the omicron or the omega would prevail over either of these letters, but if the omicron or omega is not there, then it's the priority rule, which means whichever vowel comes first is going to prevail over the others. Example here would be agapao, I love. Well, let's say we want to say this in the third person singular imperfect. Well, first of all, we're going to augment the alpha to an eta, and then we have epsilon nu. Well, that's going to form a contraction. This is a contract verb, and so we're going to combine the alpha and the epsilon. Which one comes out? Well, the alpha was first, so the alpha shows up in the contracted syllable, and this is a long alpha. Now, the accent remains on the syllable where we found it, and in this case, the accent was not on the contracted syllable, because remember, when we're doing the imperfect, the last was short, so that would ordinarily put the accent back here on the antepenult. It's going to stay there, but because of the contraction, the antepenult became the penult. Do you see that? But this long alpha is going to keep the accent there on the penult, because when you have a long ultima, then you cannot accent the antepenult. Hope that made sense. I just want to make sure you understood that, but we've added an imperfect ending, and at least before the contraction, that would create a three-syllable word, and the last syllable is short, so that would leave us with the accent on the antepenult, but after the contraction, that long alpha was going to keep it there, but now it becomes the penult. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the way the rule would apply under the terms of Rule 6. Now there's three more rules here. This has to do with combining a vowel with a diphthong, and so these are a slightly different application, but you'll find that the principles are pretty similar. The first of these is that a vowel is absorbed into the diphthong beginning with a like vowel. The vowel is simply absorbed. This is the easiest one. So if I have phileo, and then I want to put it in the third person singular, it would be philee. This vowel is going to be absorbed. It just disappears, and the result is fillet. Notice the accent stays on the ultima because it was on this syllable, and the contracted syllable keeps the accent, and so it becomes fillet. Anytime the accent winds up on the final syllable of a contract verb, a circumflex will be applied. So you always know how these verbs are going to be accented, and in this case we have fillet as the resulting word. The second rule is similar to the first. The only difference is that this has to do with the vowel combining with the diphthong, where the first letter of the following diphthong is different. So again, by way of example, here we have agapao. Let's say we want to put this in the second person singular. Well, we would have agapa and then the ending ace. And if we're going to combine these two, then the rule says that we're going to, in a sense, disregard the iota, except in the case of an iota, it actually becomes an iota subscript. But the basic contraction here is the alpha combines with the epsilon. Because the alpha preceded, the alpha remains in view, but it becomes a long alpha. Normally, this second letter disappears, but if it happens to be an iota, it becomes an iota subscript. So we're going to have agapas. Again, the resulting word has the accent on the ultima, and anytime the accent winds up on the ultima in a contract verb, it's going to be a circumflex, which is what we have there. So agapao becomes agapas in the second person singular. All right, now I'd like to just talk a little bit about how the contract verbs behave in areas besides the present system. Everything we've been talking about, these rules of contraction, apply only in the present system, which you recall is the first of the principal parts. When we go to the second of the principal parts, the future system, then what we find is that rather than a contraction, the sigma is introduced. You recall that the sigma is the sign of the future, so luo becomes luso, I will loose. If it's a contract verb, however, the sigma is going to be introduced right between the vowel, which would be contracted otherwise, and the ending. And so it's going to be agape sa. The alpha is lengthened to an eta, and that always occurs. You have the lengthening of the vowel, the sigma, and then the future ending. So that's the way it works. If you come over here, the same thing. We have phileo. It becomes phileso. You see how that works? The epsilon is lengthened to an eta. The sigma is introduced, followed by the future ending. Deloo, same thing. We have deloo. We lengthen the omicron to an omega, deloso, and then the normal ending. Actually, these are easier, you see, if you notice that, than the rules of contraction. So just be aware of that. Similarly, when we go to the aorist system, the third of the principal parts, we augment, of course. We have the same thing, however, agape, sigma there, and then the aorist ending. So it's agape sa. Over here, aphilesa. You see that? We have the sigma there, and down here we have adelosa. So again, what we've done is we've simply left that lengthened vowel there with the sigma and then the aorist ending. In the aorist passive, we haven't looked at the fourth and fifth of these, the perfect system yet, but the aorist passive system, you're going to have something like this. We're going to have the augment, agape, same deal. There's the lengthened alpha, but now the sign of the aorist passive is the theta, and then we have the normal aorist passive endings. So it's going to be agapathane. Similarly here, aphilathane, and down here adolothane. So you can see in each case, it's pretty straightforward. And it's actually easier, I think, to form the various parts of the contract verb in the other of the principal parts, because there's no contractions going on and the rules of contraction don't apply. You're simply lengthening the vowel, inserting the sigma, and then putting the regular ending on that you would otherwise find. All right, well, I hope that makes some degree of sense. What I'd like to do now is go ahead and take a look, as we usually do, at the first three of the exercises, the translation exercises, and then the composition exercises. And I'll turn you loose to work on the rest of these. And again, the answer key is provided, and hopefully that'll be sufficiently helpful for you to work through the rest of these. So let's take a look at the first of them. This is number one of the translation. It's uk eulogese hotheos ton me peripetunta kata tas intolos tu Jesu. We immediately recognize, of course, we have some contract verbs in here. First of all, I have uk. I know that that's going to be involved with the indicative. The verb here, eulogese, I suspect, of course, it's going to be from eulogeo, because that's what it looks like. And I see that we have a long eta here. Eta is always long, of course. So I know that euloge became euloge. The sigma, together with the third person singular ending, and no augment back here, tells me this is the future tense, third person singular. So it's going to be something to the effect, he will not bless. You see, eulogeo means to bless. So he will not bless. Subject of the sentence is hotheos. God will not bless ton the me peripetunta. This is a participle, and I know the verb peripeteo. I know that what I've got here is an epsilon that has been combined with the accusative singular masculine ending, which is onta. Remember that? And so when I combine those two, remember that epsilon, omicron in any order are always going to give me u. And so peripetunta is the accusative singular masculine participle of walking. So the not walking, God will not bless the not walking, kata, according to, tas intolos, accusative, plural, the commandments, to Jesu, of Jesus. God will not bless the one who does not walk according to the commandments of Jesus. The second of our translation exercises, hoi agapomenoi, hupo tu Jesu, agaposi ton agaponta autus. All right, so we have hoi agapomenoi. Well, I recognize agapao, of course, and I see this ending is going to be omenoi. I recognize that as a middle or passive ending of the present participle. And so this is going to be a middle or passive ending, likely passive, of course. And so with that, we have hoi agapomenoi, the being loved, hupo tu Jesu, by Jesus. And now agaposi, this is going to be the simple indicative here, third person plural. It's agapa combined with usi, and I combine the omicron with the alpha, and it gives me omega. I disregard the upsilon. So if you just spell this out, and if that was a little bit too quick, we have the final alpha here combined with usi, you see, which is the third person plural. I drop the upsilon. I combine the alpha and the omicron. Omicron always wins in that contest and becomes the long of omicron, omega. So it's agaposi, because the accent started there, it ends there. The final epsilon is short, so we know a circumflex will land on the penult. So those who are being loved by Jesus love ton the agaponton, which is the accusative masculine singular contracted from agapao, the loving them, or the one who loves them. Kind of a convoluted sentence, but it's testing your memory of participles and your application of the rules of contraction here. So those who are being loved by Jesus love the one who loves them. Those who are being loved by Jesus love the one who loves them. And our final translation exercise, laluntos tu Jesu tois akaluthusin argzato ho arkon parakalein auton apelthein. All right, well, what do we have here? Laluntos. I notice that this appears to be the participle. This looks like the genitive, singular, masculine, possibly neuter, but most likely masculine. In the present tense, the present participle. The simplest way to render that ordinarily is just speaking. The genitive makes me think maybe this will be a genitive absolute, and sure enough, I see tu Jesu in the genitive case, and so I'm going to take that together as a genitive absolute and at least preliminarily translated Jesus while speaking, tois, dative, singular, or dative plural rather, masculine, Jesus while speaking to the, and then akaluthusin, this appears to be the dative plural participle ending in the masculine. So while Jesus is speaking to the following him ones, and we could put a little comma there because that's the end of the genitive absolute, then we have the sentence proper, ho arkon, the ruler, argzato, began. This, you may recall, is from arco, if that seems a little bit confusing. We start with arco, but of course to begin is deponent, so it's archomai. When we put it in the aorist, we augment the alpha here, and then we transform the chi into a gazi, and we use the aorist middle endings on this deponent verb. So argzato is where that came from. The ruler began. Parakalein is an infinitive. To exhort, you see, parakalein with the present present infinitive ending, began to exhort auton him. Apelthein is simply the second aorist infinitive here, to go away. So, while Jesus was speaking to those who were following him, the ruler began to exhort him to go away. All right, hopefully that is reasonably straightforward. Let's take a look at the first three of the composition exercises. These are on page 149. The first of them reads from Machen's text here, "These things spake Jesus to those who were following him out of Galilee." Spake, of course, is one of those old King James terms, but Machen uses it to simply illustrate his point. And of course, if you're using the King James, you're going to see that verb. We might put it in more up-to-date English. Jesus spoke these things to those who were following him, but either way is fine. So those things, well, I know that in the neuter accusative plural, akena, is those things. Just a reminder, that's the short alpha, so we'll have a circumflex on the penult. Those things Jesus spoke is simply going to be the aorist of laleo, so I add the augment a or a, la. I lengthen the lale to the eta, lale, add the sigma, which would be the sign of the aorist in this case, and the third person singular ending. So it's alelasen. Alelasen. He spoke those things. Jesus is the subject. Ho Jesus. Jesus spoke those things. Tois, to thee. Akaluthusin. Here's akalutheo. We have a contraction going on here. We're going to have the epsilon is contracted with the omicron upsilon sigma iota, which is the dative plural masculine ending. Again, we drop the upsilon, and whenever you have an omicron and an epsilon combined, it produces omicron upsilon, so it's akaluthusin. To the following, remember that follow akalutheo takes the dative, so the following him ones, ek tes Galileos, out of Galilee. Jesus spoke those things to those who were following him out of Galilee. The second of the exercises here, the composition exercises. I was beholding him who had loved me and died in behalf of me. So I was beholding is the imperfect. I start with theoreo, augment it, a theo, and then the is combined with omicron nu. And of course, whenever you have an omicron and an epsilon, it produces the omicron upsilon. Because the accent would not fall on one of those, I can keep it back here. So it winds up on the penult. A long ultima prohibits an acute, and a circumflex on the penult, pursuant to lilac pen, last is long, acute on the penult. And so a theorun, I was beholding the agapesonta. Notice that this is an aorist participle. It's I was beholding him who had loved me. We don't augment because it's a participle, but we do lengthen the agapa to agape, add the sigma, sign of the aorist, and the aorist accusative singular ending, the having the one who had loved me. I was beholding him who had loved me. The me here, of course, is enclitic. So we have an acute on the last syllable of agapesonta, pursuant to the rules of enclitic accent, and apathonanton. Now remember, this is a second aorist. Apathonon means to die, I die. This is a participle, so we're not going to augment it. So it's apathon, and then we add the what amounts to the present participle ending, but because it's second aorist, it has an aorist meaning. And who died, huper emu, on my behalf. Remember that ordinarily prepositions take the emphatic form of the personal pronoun. And so we have, I was beholding him who had loved me and died on my behalf. And finally, let's look at number 3. Let us worship the one who does these things and bless his holy name. All right, let us worship is the hortatory subjunctive, first person plural. I know the verb proskuneo is I worship. I'm going to add to that the first person plural subjunctive ending, omen. So proskuneomen combines by contraction to proskunomen, with the accent winding up there on the omega. And so proskunomen, let us worship. To, remember this proskuneo takes the dative, so to, him who, poiunti, this is from poieo, with the dative singular masculine ending. Let us worship the doing these things, tauta one, the one who is doing these things, and eulagomen, this is again the hortatory subjunctive, eulagao with omen, contracts to eulagomen, circumflex on the penult, and bless, ta onima, the name, autu of him, to hagion, the holy. You could, of course, configure these last words differently, but this would be a very common way you'd find it in the New Testament, the name of him, the Holy One. All right, well, is your head spinning a little bit? This can be somewhat confusing, but I think if you work through the exercises, think about each one. Be sure you figure out just how the rules of contraction were applied, and I think by the time you're done, you'll find that this is not quite as complicated as it might have seemed at first brush. Anyway, contract verbs are very common in the New Testament. You're going to run into them countless times, and this is really the right moment for you to master them and get a good feel for them and be comfortable with them before we move on to the next chapter. So it's been a pleasure to have you here with us. I hope God is blessing your studies of Greek and that the light at the end of the tunnel is being an inducement to you to keep on with your studies. Until we see you next time, may God continue to richly bless you.